Hi class. This presentation is going to be dedicated to the philosophy of Plato, uh, one of the most famous figures in the history of philosophy. If we try to situate Plato in the the history of philosophy that we've looked at so far, I mean the history of Greek philosophy, we we did videos on the first philosophers, on the pre-Socratics. Then we followed that with, we said that was the first stage of philosophy. Then we followed that with a video on Socrates and the sophist, kind of the second stage. And then this phase, we're going to put Plato and Aristotle together. And you can see, if you look at the progression of the questions that each of these groups of philosophers dealt with, that there's been some interesting developments. So we started with pre-Socratics with a relatively limited set of questions about the natural world, and primarily trying to identify what the basic stuff is in the world, and also trying to explain uh, the basis of change, which seems so obvious when we look at the world. So that was their focus, doing natural philosophy. In the second development, we looked at Socrates and the sophists, and we saw that the interest of philosophers shifted from trying to explain the natural world to questions about the inner world of human beings, in particular, what can we know, and what can we know about the good life. Plato and Aristotle then brings us into what we could call the third stage of philosophy. These are all pretty much in direct succession, one after the other. But Plato and Aristotle, their interest and their philosophical questions and treatments went uh, far beyond anything that the pre-Socratics did, and also far beyond even what Socrates and the sophists were interested in. So you get really, with Plato and Aristotle, pretty two comprehensive treatments of philosophy that are going to be very influential as we head into the future. Plato is still very much situated within what we could refer to as the golden age of ancient Greece. I've included here another rendering of Athens, of the Acropolis in Athens. And this, it's just hard to imagine, although kind of fascinating to try, what it would have been like to live in this time period and in this place. So the, the level, the development of the architecture and the entire atmosphere is pretty amazing. Plato was born into a noble family in Athens, a family that was wealthy and very influential in terms of political power. As a young man, he became very much influenced by the figure of Socrates, or the person of Socrates, and considered himself a student of Socrates, and was one of the bright young men of the time who followed Socrates around and participated and listened to his teachings and his conversations with other people. And this influence was to be a lifelong, affect a lifelong interest for Plato in the subject of philosophy. Plato was present during the trial and the eventual death, execution of Socrates, and very much disillusioned that Athens had carried this out. And I believe for a time he left the city of Athens and traveled. Eventually he did return to the city, and he established one of the really first major academy, or what you could call an institution of higher learning, kind of as almost a university status in Athens. And he directed activities there, and he taught there, lectured, and invited other people to come and study there as well. So he spent the rest of his life teaching there. Plato wrote dialogues, which I've previously described as dramatic presentations of philosophical conversations or discussions. In the earliest dialogues that Plato wrote, they were about Socrates and the way Socrates lived his philosophy and the events surrounding his death as well. And Socrates became the main character in all of Plato's dialogues. There's at least 20 of them, maybe 24. I don't know. I think there's only one of them that doesn't have Socrates as kind of the main character. So it was a way of kind of tribute to his teacher, to give Socrates that role in all the stories that he wrote. So it's interesting. We never have a case where Plato says, "This is what I, Plato, think about anything," but we get these dialogues that Plato wrote, in which Socrates is kind of the mouthpiece for Plato. Again, the earliest dialogues were probably closer to the real life figure of Socrates, but later you see that Plato takes his character Socrates, far beyond the interest that Socrates actually had during his lifetime, and moves into all these different areas of philosophy, including metaphysics and theory of knowledge, as what we call epistemology. And we'll see some of that as we go forward. So as we stated before, Plato covered kind of the entire range of philosophical questions, all the different areas that we could study even today in philosophy. Plato had had done work in it, and had done significant work. And it's still not the case that people would agree with everything Plato had to say, but you would still say that if you were going to do research on all these different philosophical subjects, you'd kind of have to include at least something about Plato's contributions to those subjects. One of the modern philosophers who was a major philosopher during his time, Alfred North Whitehead, went so far as to say that all subsequent philosophy was but a footnote on Plato, that Plato had identified all the major questions that people would be interested in as philosophy progressed throughout history. And you'd say he had something intelligent to say about all these questions, so you kind of had to take him into account. For us, we kind of have to pick and choose what we want to look at in Plato. We can't, treat the whole of his philosophy. In graduate school, in a philosophy program, you would spend a whole semester on just one of his dialogues, or sometimes more than one semester on just one of his dialogues, let alone try to dig into everything that Plato had to say. So for us, we're going to pick 3 different ideas that we could say they all overlap with each other. In some sense, they all bring the same kind of ideas to the table, but they do it in different ways. So it's different ways. Sometimes there's different ways of talking about the same things, and you have different ways of talking about things so that you can bring out different aspects of it. Any particular one approach isn't enough to reveal everything that's contained within these ideas. So we're going to focus on what I've referred to as the two realms of reality. You could say Plato was a dualist. For him, there were two kinds of things that existed. You say there were things that were sensible and things that were intelligible, two different like basic kinds of stuff. And we'll see those. I'm not going to go into them yet. I mean, we're going to look at them as we go forward, and especially in the divided line analogy. So Plato was a kind of dualist. The second thing we want to talk about, I mean, is maybe the most famous image in the history of philosophy is Plato's story about the cave, or the allegory of the cave, or sometimes referred to as the myth of the cave. And this, you could say that the cave was an image which represented human beings with respect to what they knew about reality or what they didn't know. So you could say it's about our education or our lack of education about what the truth of reality is. The third item is the theory of the forms, and probably this is the most controversial of the ideas within Plato's body of ideas, and the one that would probably draw the most criticism still today. But you see, there's some basis for it in the way that Plato talks about things, although it's still controversial. Well, we can start by saying something about Plato's dualism. You could say Plato thought the world was divided up between two different realms, both of them real, but different in their natures. I'm going to say the first realm was he called intelligible, and this would be having to do with the mind, with the world of ideas, or kind of like the inner world of a human being. And here you would depend on the mind in order to try and understand things. This would be the world that we referred to in Socrates as the psyche in this part of the human being. The other realm is the physical realm, or the sensible realm, and this is the world, the external world of bodily things, material reality. And you could say we know about the external world through our senses, thus we use the word sensible. So there's that's that realm. If we look at the status of how things exist, you could say, I'm going back to the sensible realm now. I mean, you could say that everything that we know about the physical reality is kind of, as Heraclitus had said, everything's constantly changing. And Plato is going to use this word, everything's in the process of becoming. And becoming is interesting because, in a way, becoming is that which is and is not sort of at the same time. I don't know if you remember, Parmenides said a thing can't both be and not be at the same time, but here in the sensible world, everything's in the process of becoming something different. So it is and it's not kind of what it is anyway. So that was Plato's way of trying to to identify a kind of reality in between being and non-being. So you had being, non-being, and in between the two you'd have things which were in the process of becoming. That meant that there was a realm between what we know and what we're ignorant of. Usually, thinkers would want to say that when you have knowledge of something, you know what is. You have knowledge of being. And that's kind of what Parmenides was arguing about back with the pre-Socratics. And with respect to what doesn't exist, what is nothing, what's non-being, you couldn't have any knowledge of what isn't, so that would just be ignorance. But this in-between world that Plato wants to say is the sensible world, where everything's always changing. You couldn't have knowledge of it because it's always, what it is you're trying to understand is always shifting as you think about it or talk about it. So the best that you can get in terms of knowledge was just opinions about things. So that's in the sensible realm. If we trust what our eyes and ears and our senses and so forth tell us about things, we're going to have a kind of limited understanding. So there's this distinction between the intelligible world, where you can have knowledge, and the sensible world, where the best that you can attain is just opinions about things, depending on what you emphasize in terms of your approach. It's really the idea of forms, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail in a few slides here. But for Plato, the forms were really the originals of things. That forms were like real things, but they were intelligible things. So if you wanted to really have knowledge of something, you had to kind of penetrate to the level of the forms. In actual reality, in bodily reality, say everything is just a kind of a copy of the essential form, or a reflection of it, or an image, cast in some way, but not the thing itself, but an image of it. So you have these two worlds, one a world of thought, the other a realm of body, mind, intelligible, body, sensible. And in Plato, always what the intelligible world is going to be given more importance. So it's thought of as the higher dimension of reality. It's thought of as what's primary, so it has a kind of priority. And in Plato's view, everything in the sensible world, in the physical world, is kind of derivative or secondary in terms of its significance. And so everything originates in this intelligible realm with the forms, in a way. So we'll see how that plays out when we think about it from the standpoint of the other major ideas. Here we have the first of two images that Plato makes use of in an attempt to explain how he sees the relationship between the intelligible world and the visible world. So the second one's going to be the allegory of the cave. This one's called the divided line. It says here divided plane, but divided line analogy. So here he makes a division. It says you take a long vertical line and you divide it in unequal segments. So beneath the horizontal line, you have things that represent things that exist in the visible world. Above the horizontal line, you have things that exist in the intelligible world. And you can see this already has the intelligible reality is higher than the visible or the sensible world. Visible is just another way of talking about sensible. Intelligible is a world that's invisible. So he divides this, and on the left-hand side of, let's see, on the left-hand side of this vertical line, you have objects known, and on the right-hand side, you have states of mind that correspond with what's being known. Anyway. So if you start at the very bottom, say with images, here this is corresponding to inside the cave. This is kind of the level, this very bottom, you would say this is the world inside the cave. What we know of reality is we're just looking at images. These are the shadows on the wall of the cave. And what we understand as a result of this is just, in his view, imagination. Still within the visible world, when you achieve you escape from your chains or something, then you could say, then you see things in the cave more clearly. You're not locked into just what the show on the wall is, but you see what the basis for how that show is getting on the wall. You'd say then you're looking at the real things, and those are actual things inside the cave. And you say here, then you're at the stage of what he calls belief. And when the prisoner escapes from the cave or climbs out of the cave, you could say he enters into, it's symbolic of him entering into another realm of reality, and that's the realm of the intelligible world. So in Plato's view, the real world is the world outside the cave. And this is kind of what we have to get to in order to start understanding what the truth of reality is. Inside the cave, we're kind of locked into a view where we think the only things that are real is what our senses tell us. So when you get out of the cave, you go through further levels of understanding again. And you could say then ultimately you're going to get to the point where you have true knowledge of things, and what you're going to have knowledge of is the things themselves. We'll see this, when we look at the next image, that of the cave as well. I once heard this vertical line that goes up through the middle here, that this is called like the slippery pole of being, and which is an interesting way to put things. So it's kind of, you could say everything here has a kind of existence, but it's like the things at the top have a greater degree of existence. They have more being. The things at the bottom in the visible world, they have an existence, but it's a lesser degree of existence, a lesser degree of being. So these are the things that you would say are always, this is the world where everything's always changing. And the knowledge that we have based on trying to understand things within this world is always just going to be at the level of opinions. Here, I mean, that's another term for doxa, is a word for opinions. Once we get out of the cave, we enter into the realm of thinking, and then more and more pure thinking, and ultimately you reach a level with pure thought of being able to understand the highest kinds of things that you can know, and you say these are the forms, you can understand the idea of the good is the highest object of knowledge. And if you had that, then you would have a clear understanding of things. It's pretty confusing, but hopefully you can get some sense of what Plato is after. When he initially draws the divided line, I mean, there's other divisions. He said, first you divide the vertical line in unequal, then you're supposed to divide the new segments in the same proportion, so there should be kind of a division right about here, and then another division about here, and then it's kind of in the same proportion as the first line was cut. So there's some sort of in the background, some kind of mathematical thinking involved in how Plato lays out all of reality. There's a very definite influence of Pythagoras and his mathematical understanding of reality still in the philosophy of Plato. Here we have the second image that we wanted to look at, the allegory of the cave. I'd like to note that these two images, the divided line analogy and then the allegory of the cave, these are both found in Plato's most famous dialogue, the Republic. And they're found almost at the very center of that work, and which is a pretty big work. And it's at the moment in the story of the Republic, at the very center of it, Plato is concerned with education, and in particular, he's concerned with the education of the young philosophers who are, in his view, destined to rule the Republic. So they need the very best education. They should understand what the true nature of reality is before they take on the task of running the Republic. So this whole question of how you educate people and what the basis of that education is supposed to be about, I mean, is kind of what's at issue in these two images. And clearly it has to do with this distinction between the intelligible aspect of reality and the sensible aspect of reality. You could say as we go forth, this will become an issue, like that there's a kind of within the experience of human beings, there's the inner world of a human being, there's the world of thought, the world of consciousness, and so forth. And then there's also the world within which we live, which is, you could say, the physical reality, organic reality, the world of bodily things, physical reality. So we have mind and we have body, and both seem to have a kind of reality associated with them. And Plato's argument is that the reality, ultimately, the reality of the mind, the reality of the inner world, within the inner world of human beings, the reality in the world of inner consciousness is a higher world. And the reality of the body and external reality, physical things, is in his view a lesser aspect of the real world. So we see that in the divided line. Material reality is at the bottom of the line. And here we see it's depicted again in this image of the cave, in which we're told, I mean, that this image is still about education, and how the philosophers are to be educated. So he asked us to imagine in the beginning prisoners who've been in this cave for all their lives. And And all they've known of reality is what they can see, which is what's right in front of them, the shadows on the wall. And because that's all they've ever seen, that's what they take reality to be. That's their direct experience of reality. So it's not until they're liberated, or somebody sets the prisoners free, or sets a prisoner free, and encourages them or helps them stand up and take a look around, that the prisoner can become aware that what he's trusted as being true, I mean, the whole of his existence isn't the last word in what the truth is, that really there's a reality beyond the one that he's known all his life. So initially, you can imagine the experience, and Plato sort of walks us through this. What's the experience of the prisoner who's sort of forced to stand up and take a look around? He would definitely be dazed, and he would be confused by everything that he saw. And he would be blinded by looking in the direction of the fire, so he'd never look directly at any light that intense in his whole existence. And if he was given a choice at that point, he'd probably want to sit back down again and turn towards the shadows, because he was used to the shadows. He was comfortable with them. This new vision, which confuses him and sort of scares him, he would have to be encouraged to continue to stand there and try to take it all in. But if he did, if he stood and continued to look, eventually his eyes would adjust to the new level of light, and he would begin to see what caused the shadows he'd all his life believed in, that they were the result of these people parading behind the wall, and that they were just shadows of the objects which were being shown. So then, I mean, he could be encouraged to continue his ascent out of the cave, and you have to assume this journey into the intelligible world is a difficult journey, and there's like resistance at almost every stage. So the prisoner who's trying to escape from the cave would have to overcome all his fears and uncertainties in order to go forward, because really he's moving into the world of the unknown, and it's difficult to leave behind a world, even though it's not what it should be. I mean, it's one that we know and we feel comfortable with. So it looks like the interior of the cave represents the lower the realm below the horizontal line. I mean, in the image we just looked at before in the divided line. This is physical reality. And you say there's different levels here. So one level would be, it's like the lowest level on the divided line as the prisoners just looking at the shadows. And the next level is the prisoners uh, escaping, and coming around, but still in the cave, and sort of seeing what's causing things, seeing that the shadows on the wall are caused by these objects which are being held above the wall, kind of like a puppet show. You see, the whole image is kind of like a theater, or you say it's a puppet show, it's kind of like a movie theater as well, that the prisoners are kind of buying into what they're seeing. But that's an interesting relation. So you start with the shadows, and then you have the objects which make the shadows. They're still not the real things. They're just representations. They're like statues or puppets or something. And the real things that are the basis for these images or these representations are things that exist outside the cave. So before the prisoner can come to understand the true nature of reality, he has to make the arduous journey outside of the cave. Plato kind of suggests he would have to have help by somebody who had made the journey before, and that it would be a gradual ascent because the eyes would have to adjust at all the different levels that one would have to pass through. But ultimately, the prisoner would make his way outside of the cave. You can imagine that's the one shortcoming of this particular image is it doesn't depict the external world where the actual things are in a way. So here we just escape. We just get to the out of the believing in the reality of what appears to be the case for us. But when the prisoner would get out, he'd still have to go through this period of adjustment and being able, his eyes would have to adjust in order to see things outside the cave. He'd be more comfortable looking at night by the light of the moon, and eventually his eyes would get stronger and he'd be able to look in the light of day. And at the very end, he'd be able to take in the last thing he would be able to see and comprehend would be the sun itself, which was the source of light in the external world. I don't want to be repeating myself so much, and I feel like maybe I have already a bit, but this is this information on this slide. I've already said most of this. I'll just repeat it briefly. That the interior of the cave for Plato represents the sensible world, the world of physical reality. In his view, if that's all we rely on in order to understand the nature of reality, that the best that we can ever come to are opinions about things, because that everything that we're looking at is always changing, so you can't know a truth once and for all, although he still feels that there are truths once and for all that we can attain to. But inside the cave, if we just rely on physical reality, that all we can get are the appearances of things, not the things themselves. And the idea is to escape the interior of the cave and to make it into the outer world, into what he views as the real world, or the truer world. And so that's the whole idea of education. You can see the image of light is very powerful in the cave. I mean, and that's undeniable. And what makes the whole image of the cave work is this idea that we move from darkness into the light, that's kind of what happens when we become educated, that we're moving out of the darkness or a dimly lit environment into one where we see things more clearly. And there's a kind of journey involved in educating ourselves in that way, and the cave is supposed to illustrate that. So when we get into the exterior world, the intelligible world, then it's possible for us to know the things themselves and know the truths about things. Ultimately, that's going to be, in Plato's view, knowledge of the forms. And again, the whole process is an educational process. How do we become educated? How do we come to know, what does it mean to understand things better, or to grow in terms of our understanding? It's kind of like moving out of the darkness of the cave into the light of day. And it's an ascent, and it's a difficult uphill journey, and there's resistance at like almost every step along the way. Just for one thing, there is, you have to overcome fear. It's not like fear of being hurt or something, but more it's kind of more of a psychological kind of fear, or a fear of the unknown. It's difficult for us to leave a reality that we're familiar with and to venture off into a reality that we don't really understand or know very well. But that's kind of what's necessary in order to get to a better understanding. And also, we get to overcome ignorance, this sort of belief that, and you could say that's kind of why Plato presents the allegory of the cave, is to give us an image which indicates that that what we take for reality is not all there is to reality, but there's something beyond what we already know, that there's something more that we could know about the world that we live in. So, we need to become aware of the truth of what our situation is, and also of the possibility of moving forward from there. I've just moved on to the next slide, but I have one more comment on the allegory of the cave, and before I start to talk about the theory of forms, and that is, if you read in the text that what Plato says happens to the prisoner once he becomes enlightened, once he achieves, the final vision of the true nature of things in the outside world. And then he kind of asked, well, what happens then for the escaped prisoner? And he suggests that the prisoner really should go back in the cave and to help enlighten others. That probably he needed help himself to escape from the cave and get to the level where he's at, but then he kind of owes it to those who helped him to go back and to help others. And he said that's kind of a dangerous undertaking, that when the prisoner would go back into the cave, nobody would understand what he was talking about, and they might even get angry with him and kill him, kind of like they did Socrates. That's one idea, but there's another way to try and understand why the prisoner might have to go back in the cave, and it makes sense to me. I mean, is that the cave, I think the cave can represent our bodies. And you could say it's kind of, if you want to take it this way, this whole story of the movement from the sensible into the intelligible, it's kind of a movement which takes place within our own selves, So it's like you can't really leave your body behind, but you do have to free your thought from the ways in which it's governed by its bodily existence. So the prisoner is sort of like, you make this journey into the intelligible world so that you can understand things with with your liberated mind. But ultimately, then you still have to live in your body, so you have to go back into the cave again. And he just says, I mean, following the imagery of it, that the prisoner who goes back in the cave, his eyes would be clouded again when he went back into the darkness, and he would be confused, and then people might say, what's the point of going out? Look how confused this guy is. But he says that once the prisoner gets used to being in the cave again, and the one who's escaped, and been outside, and then he comes back in. Plato actually says that prisoner, once his eyes became accustomed again, that he would see things 10,000 times more clearly than the people in the cave, because he'd seen the truth of things, like in the external world. So that's a pretty dramatic claim, but it kind of makes sense, that You don't really leave the body behind once and for all, but you do kind of need to liberate your ability to think about things from the confines of the body. Anyhow, what this page is focused on is the theory of forms, and this is kind of what Plato argues we're trying to get to. This is what you're trying to understand when you get into the exterior world. You want to see things the way they are in themselves, and for him, that's seeing the forms of things. So here, as it says, that he believed that everything in the regular world is based on something that there's an eternal form for it in the intelligible world. So everything inside the cave that the prisoner saw is related to a form which exists in the material world. And so in order to know the truth about something, you have to make it, to the point where you can see the form of the things that you understood dimly, sort of within the cave. These things that we're trying to understand, they're intelligible things. They're things that actually exist, not just as ideas in the mind. They have an actual existence, at least in Plato's thought. But they don't exist in a material way. They're kind of intelligible things. They're like ideas. He wants to say they're not ideas in your mind, but nonetheless, they're kind of like ideas. And I think the Greek word which is translated as form is close to the word idea. And these forms, what are you going to say that they are? I think one way to think about them is that they're kind of like the definitions, that Socrates was seeking all the time. That Socrates was trying to understand what something actually is, and for him that would be expressed in a definition. I'll tell you what a thing actually is. And it's kind of like when you try to get to the forms, you're trying to get to something like a definition, that there's something at the basis of all the different interpretations of things. One of the words that I think helps, it's not a common word, but it's this word exemplar that sometimes you would hear in religious context. And yeah, an exemplar was supposed to be an idea of something as it would have existed in the mind of God before God created everything. And it seems as though that's close to what a form is for Plato. So if you said God had an idea of what human beings were and then created human beings, you'd say the idea of human beings as they existed in the mind of God would be exemplar, or that would be the form of a human being. And no individual human being could measure up entirely, to the idea itself, but it's like each individual human being would be kind of like a copy or an instance of this universal or pure form in a way. Okay, one of the topics that Plato talks about on a number of different occasions is the question of beauty. So we're going to try and make use of this as an example of an important form, actually one of the most important of the forms, and the relationship between this form and particular things. I've already said this, but it's not so different from what Socrates was doing. When Socrates was looking for the definitions of things, Socrates thought we had confused ideas about things, and we need to try and become more clear about what they really are. And Plato is really just continuing that effort, except now he's talking about
forms instead of just definitions. And for him, a form is something more than just a definition. As he sees it, a form is something that actually has an existence, not like material things, but an existence of a kind of intellectual type. What we're seeing here is not so different from what we've discussed earlier in terms of the divided line analogy, and then also the allegory, the cave as well. We see these different realms that Plato is talking about in his dualistic vision of reality. At the top of this slide, you see the intelligible realm. And we said this is where the realm that Plato's always trying to get us to enter into. This is where the truth of things resides. You say, if we want to have knowledge of something, you have to penetrate into the intelligible side of things, and then you can have real knowledge. And real knowledge always corresponds with that which has being, that which is. You can't have knowledge without knowing what is. So in this realm is where all the forms reside. And the forms are different than the things at the bottom of the page because they're not subject to time. I mean, when we're talking about beauty as a form, we're talking about beauty itself, not some beautiful thing, but beauty in a kind of timeless sense. And you say this is the essence of beauty or the truth of beauty. Down at the lower part of the page, we can see some of the particular things that we might refer to as beautiful things. And these are going to be different. They're all in the realm, they're all subject to the passage of time. We say this is where things are always in the process of becoming. Here, things are always, in this realm, things are always changing. And this is the realm of reality that we can become familiar with through our physical senses. So this is the sensible realm. I've included some images as examples of this. You know, on the right, there's a sunset. In second from the right are some orchids. And I've tried to pick a couple of figures or people. These are actually from the history of Western art. You know, on the far left is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, and next to her is a figure of David by Michelangelo. These latter two examples are a little questionable in this for this purpose here, because what's best for examples of things in the sensible world is that you can tell that they're subject to time. I mean, works of art are subject to the passage of time, but they're a lot longer lasting than sunsets and flowers. So The Birth of Venus and Donatello's David have been around for a long time, and they'll probably be around for a long time as well in the future. Although they depict things that, you know, you could say if Venus was an actual person, this would just depict her at a certain stage of her existence, and likewise David. And you would think that, you know, real people, they age, they may be beautiful at a certain age. But as time passes, you know, they may have some inner beauty, but their outer beauty fades. Okay, the question of beauty is, as I've already said, it's one of a number of questions that might have come up as a result of a dialogue with others, or in one of the Socratic dialogues where people are discussing something and there's a difference of opinion. And they realize at a certain point that they need to be clear about what something really means. So then you would have a question could be formulated and say, well, what really are we talking about here? And when we're talking about beauty. So then you can have this discussion which can take off from that. In this case, as in the other cases where one of the forms is investigated, the, the first thing you have to determine is whether or not there is such a thing. So you say, if you're going to talk about beauty and try and figure out what it is, you have to first be clear as to whether or not there actually is such a thing as beauty. Once you agree to that, or you come to, you acknowledge that there is such a thing, but it's still in question what it is, then you can begin the investigation of what it really is. And that's the hard part. So to begin with, we have to determine that something is before we investigate what it is. In this particular case, with the question of beauty, it's difficult to determine exactly what beauty is. And early on, it's easy to see that there's a lot of different opinions as to what makes something beautiful. I mean, it's a common saying that we use is that we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So it looks as though beauty is different for everybody. And if that's the case, how can we come to some single understanding of what everybody sees differently? We could point out from the start that even though it's true that everybody sees things a bit differently in this regard, nonetheless, that when somebody tells me that they think that what they're looking at is beautiful, uh, I can still nonetheless understand what they're saying. I may disagree about the particular thing that they're referring to, whether or not it's beautiful or not, but I do understand how that particular individual views that item when he says he thinks it's beautiful. So it's not a word that's meaningless. So it's, there are a number of instances also where people would uh, be in agreement with respect to whether or not something is beautiful or not. I mean, the examples that I have up here, for instance, the one about the sunset. And there are a lot of other examples like that. I mean, a lot of people, will go to some trouble to go someplace to see a sunset because they're attracted to it or they think there's something beautiful about the moment just before a sun sets. There are also some scenes in nature. I mean, in the part of the world where we're at here, in the change of the seasons, for instance, in the fall, when the leaves change color, I mean, it creates a lot of beautiful scenes in nature. And again, people will go off in nature to to be in that sort of that kind of beauty. So I think fresh fallen new snow. A lot of people don't like snow, but when snow is fresh on the ground and it has, people might think that that's beautiful as well. Plus the flowers, as I've already indicated before, I selected an orchid here because there's some of my favorites. But I mean, you could think of a rose is generally acknowledged as a very beautiful flower, and people even write poems about roses. People is a little bit more complicated, and I've tried to come up with some images which I've already mentioned, Venus and Michelangelo's David. As I said, these are from the history of Western art. I mean, so there's something cultural. Not everybody would agree that these images are beautiful, but still a lot of people would. And I don't think we can ever expect to have universal agreement on whether or not a particular person is beautiful or not. As I said, there's cultural differences, there's historical time periods where different types of people are thought of as beautiful as well. So we're not looking for everyone to agree necessarily, but we do want some sort of general acceptance within a certain set of guidelines. So, how do we explain those commonalities that we're familiar with? It may be in the final analysis that we have to admit that there's a lot of truth in this expression that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But what do we really mean when we say that? What does that mean? And it's kind of like one of the things it definitely means is that beauty does not reside in the particular things that people want to say are beautiful. And that rather, when we think that something is beautiful, it has more to do with our individual relationship with that particular object. So in a way, it's a relationship of correspondence between the ideals of the perceiver and what the object is that determines whether or not somebody sees something as beautiful. So that really takes it out of the sensible, begins to take it out of the sensible realm. And this is kind of the direction that Plato is trying to move in anyway. So, for Plato at least, he doesn't feel that we can determine what beauty is by looking at beautiful things, which opens the question for us. I mean, how are we going to determine? How can we get to knowledge of one of these timeless forms, immaterial kind of reality? Here, I think that the way I've laid out this relationship between the form of beauty and then beautiful things, I mean, isn't so helpful, really. I mean, it's as though in this presentation, it looks like the distinction between the intelligible and the sensible is too distinct. So you wonder, how can we get from our usual perception of particular things and elevate ourselves to a point where we can understand what beauty itself is not so simple. So there has to be a kind of process which is not really included in this slide, but which we've talked about earlier. And that is, we saw the process in the divided line. We saw it again in the allegory of the cave. We kind of have to start with the particular. We have to start with opinions about things, and then elevate our understanding to the point where we're able to perceive an ideal form, to perceive something as it is in itself, and not just as a particular thing which is always changing, sort of in front of our eyes. The situation here, I've already said this, again, repeating myself, but again, the process of ascending to the realm of the intelligible, which is described in the divided line, and then again in the allegory of the cave, has to be a a gradual process which takes time, and you have to work your way sort of from the bottom up to the higher levels. I think the idea of beauty here is particularly significant example in this regard. Take you back to early on when we talked about the very first video that we had, where we talked about the nature of philosophy as the love of wisdom. And we said that Socrates preferred to talk about eros or love, as the kind of love that the philosopher has. Later in that dialogue, there's some passages that suggest, and really it's one of the few instances where Plato refers to somebody other than Socrates as the source for these ideas, but he refers to a priestess by the name of Diotima, who teaches Socrates the mysteries of love. I mean, I don't take that in any kind of low sense, but it's like, it's the love of beauty that sort of is capable of elevating us to the higher realms. And in the Greeks, and in particular Plato and still in Aristotle, you're going to say these beauty is identified with truth. Beauty is also identified with goodness. So it's like the love of beauty can help us ascend to the higher realms, and the other, important forms like truth and goodness that are associated with it. So in a way, Diotima sort of describes this as a gradual process where you open up yourself to larger and larger spheres where you can be in love with things which will elevate you, take you up to the higher realm. So there's actually a kind of ladder of love that one can make use of, and it's sort of guided by love of ideal. Initially, by love of the beautiful is what leads the way. What's obviously controversial in Plato's theory here, and one for which he's often criticized and sometimes even ridiculed, is this idea that there is an ideal realm where things like pure forms, timeless forms, exist, and that these timeless forms are somehow also related to the world that we live in. I wouldn't be too quick to judge Plato. I mean, although I have made this criticism myself in the past, I mean, it's easy to criticize things we don't entirely understand. And Plato was a pretty smart person, and he was certainly aware of the risk he was taking with this theory, and the difficulties it posed. I mean, we'll see in our next segment where Aristotle's not going to accept the theory of forms very much. But Plato would have been aware of those criticisms, and still, it's not clear even that Plato continued to hold on to the theory of forms quite to the end of his time. Anyhow, but there's something there, and he may be addressing the way we speak about things, the way we make use of words, and he's pointing to the idea that there's always something beyond what we can see and what we understand, that there's some further explanation for things that we need to try to penetrate towards. And for him, it's like some of the most important things, some of the most important words are the ones that he focused on. Things like beauty, things like justice, things like what makes something good, and stuff like that.